In the field of electronic art music, women who compose and perform are often less visible and less celebrated than their male counterparts. Pamela Z is one of the first women who was able to make a name for herself in the field. She was originally a singer studying classical performance, but became interested in using electronics to create new and unique sonic experiences. She has been active in the contemporary music scene since the 1980s, composing songs for her own voice with mixed media and live electronics. Despite her identity as a black woman, Pamela Z is ambivalent about using the term woman composer, as she feels it carries an inferior and condescending connotation. She prefers that people see her work as unique and expressive because of her individuality, not because of her identity.
Pamela Z has been active in the contemporary music scene since about the early 1980s. She went to school at the University of Colorado Boulder and studied vocal performance. She studied classical voice and kind of traditional bel canto pedagogy and was performing that kind of music in school. And then in the evenings she would perform in local cafes and clubs, doing more singer-songwriter kind of performances. It wasn't until right around 1980 that she discovered live electronics being used in a variety of genres and took some of those tools up herself and began to create music that was much more experimental in nature, and that was really what she says she was drawn to more than the kind of music she was already studying or performing. So since then she's been doing a lot of solo work, with voice and live electronics primarily. In recent years, she's also done a lot of collaborations with dance companies and other kinds of acoustic ensembles, string quartets, and groups like that doing collaborative performances with acoustic instruments and with her. Sometimes she composes just with her own voice, and over the years, over this kind of past several decades, the technology that she's used has obviously improved in leaps and bounds, and the kinds of technologies that she's been able to use and explore has changed, and her music has been shaped in turn by those technologies.
In the classical traditions of the 19th and 20th centuries, women are strongly identified with song. Composition, conversely, is a subset of music making traditionally associated with the masculine. In more recent history, electronic composition was a field pioneered equally by men and women, but due to pre-existing correlations between masculinity and technology, few of the female pioneers of the field achieved lasting fame. As Rachael Lansang has argued, Pamela Z's application of electronic processing to the sounds of her own voice subverts these gender stereotypes. By using technology and the female voice in tandem, her compositions contain a unique sound that surprises listeners and challenges their expectations of women, technology, and vocal music.
Art song is a very standard genre since maybe the late 18th century in European and North American tradition of classical music. And so she studied this when she was a student and performed it, and her voice is sort of trained in that bel canto style of pedagogy that she studied. And so she does engage with that. She doesn't kind of shy away from that kind of music making, even though she's working with electronics and she's working with really cutting edge experimental techniques. She's still also engaging with this music that's part of her own history and part of her own study, and she sings with her voice, that is very much trained in that way. So it's a very interesting layering of styles and techniques, and a lot of her solo work we could describe as song. These kind of like short standalone pieces that are really centered on the voice with accompaniment. The accompaniment in a standard art song you would expect it to be a piano, perhaps another keyboard instrument, or a small chamber group. But in this case, she creates electronic samples, and sometimes she uses her own voice through the electronics to create a kind of accompaniment for herself.
How did Pamela Z become acquainted with the equipment needed to create electronic music? Lacking a mentor in this field, she essentially stumbled across it. Gradually, she made it her own, to the extent that her musicianship was shaped by her powerful use of electronics.
She went to this Weather Report concert and she heard the bassist, Jaco Pastorius, play a bass solo with a digital delay which is a piece of hardware at the time. Now you can do all of this on a computer, on a laptop, it's very easy. But at the time it was a physical piece of hardware that could kind of loop and delay sounds electronically. And she heard this sound and it was so new to her, and she was sort of inspired to see what a voice could do with that kind of technology. So she went to the store and she bought one, and then she found herself buying more and more until she had a whole rack of digital delays in her house, and started to create music using this technology, because this extension of her voice was such an exciting way for her to access the experimental world, but through her own voice.
If Pamela Z's use of technology seems remarkable, Lansang points out that women were involved in electronic music from its beginnings.
So women have been composing electronic music for as long as it's been a working technology in our field, but they are not largely the ones who have been recognized for those efforts, especially in the tape music of the 60s, when that was in its heyday, 60s and 70s. That kind of electronic music and those places that were using those technologies, it was largely the men who were receiving accolades for those kinds of pieces and that kind of work. So the association over time becomes more and more fixed, for lack of a better word. And so when a woman comes into electronic music, it's seen as an anomaly or unusual in some way, although really it's not. We're just perhaps are less publicized. So by using her voice, in some ways, she's been able to traverse those hurdles.
Pamela Z's music making has changed over time, in large part due to the expanded capacities of the electronic tools at her disposal. Her artistry has changed hand in hand with the technology to which she had access.
She would try things out in the studio. She would create delays and delay loops, and as she got more hardware, she would complicate those layers with more and more techniques, everything that technology was capable of doing. So one of the early digital delay pieces that she wrote was called Bada Gada, which refers to really just kind of the sounds, the phonemes that she speaks during that song. Bada Gada doesn't really mean anything in any language that I'm familiar with, but she uses those sounds. She starts with ga and then says bada gada, and she loops those sounds. And sometimes she speaks them and sometimes she sings them. And through the digital delay, she kind of excavates the sounds, the musical sounds of speech. And she delays these uterations of bada gada over and over again in the digital delay and creates a sort of a thick polyphonic accompaniment. And as those layers build, she sings over top.
Ga, 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 ga,
She sings a very lyrical melody in English. And that piece, which was composed in 1988, really harnessed all of the technology that she had at the time in terms of live electronics and what she could create with it. And so she built up the layers, and then she could gradually take them away. So the way that the digital delay works is that once something is recorded and sent in delay, it can't be altered. You can add a line, you can take one away, you can sing over top, but there are limitations to what that technology can do. Now that the technology has improved since 1988, a lot of the kinds of things that a digital delay box could do can now be done on a standard laptop with GarageBand, for example. So the capacity for what can be done with live electronics has increased thousandfold. So now, when she performs Bada Gada, she does it in a similar way, but she doesn't use a hardware digital delay box anymore. She uses Max MSP software, which many composers use, and a lot of times she also uses these kind of custom designed MIDI controllers. So they're instruments that are triggered, they're gesture controlled, meaning that they stand on usually a mic stand, and she sets them up, and as she triggers them with a gesture, she can do a myriad of things. She can send a line into delay. She can manipulate the sound that's already been created. She can trigger a sample of something else, some other sound that she's recorded, natural sounds, or maybe synthesized instruments. So she can do all of this. So even though she still performs Bada Gada and it's very recognizable as that same piece, she's using more advanced tools to do so. And she's added elements to it that just weren't possible when she first composed the piece. Her work is so subjective. Although it's sometimes vague and ambiguous in meaning, it is so specific to her person, and the things that she does are so unique even among those who are composing and performing experimental electronic vocal music today. So it's important for those of us who speak about her and write about her to acknowledge those unique qualities in addition to and not in place of things like gender and racial identity.